Are you woke? Are you woke? Ever been riding in an automobile as a passenger with a sleepy driver? Notice them start to nod off and attempt to politely capture their attention so as not to offend them by tapping them on their shoulder. Have you ever noticed the familiar response, "I'm awake, I'm awake"? There seems to be a hardwired defensive reflex in human psychology to deny wrongdoing, even in the face of empirical evidence to the contrary, and any attorney in court to a mathematical certainty has either seen it or tried it in a court of law. And why not? Because sometimes it actually works. And if you haven't yet noticed, there are a lot of inaccuracies on the internet, especially prevalent in memes that become the shared content of persons who wish to validate themselves among their social media friends as learned and erudite scholars. And ironically, one is a quotation attributed to Frederick Douglass, an emancipated slave and abolitionist who was described by one contemporary feminist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as majestic in his wrath, and the false representation states that an education makes a man unfit to be a slave. But the fact is that, just like the quotation often attributed to Plato, strange times are these in which we live when old and young are taught in falsehood school, and the one that dares to tell the truth is called at once a lunatic and a fool, stating the maxim that was not ever written until 15 centuries after he lived, and actually appeared on page 5 of George Francis Train's Pen Sketches of Nebraskans with Photographs, which was published in 1871. Frederick Douglass never actually said that about education making a man unfit to be a slave. Mr. Hugh Alls, the Baltimore slave master who had acquired Frederick Douglass from his brother, Captain John Alls, was recorded to have said, "Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. How?" said he, "If you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master." This entire vignette from the life of Frederick Douglass, about the age of 8, appears on page 35 and 36 of his autobiography. But now, for a moment, try to contemplate the impact of just that misunderstanding on a highly educated and enlightened voter. A highly educated and enlightened voter who believes he knows all of the facts and cannot possibly be wrong, because he saw the truth written like lightning in a meme on social media posted by his highly educated and enlightened friend. And he decided to share it with others. And consider the impact if, as a highly educated and enlightened parent or teacher, he passes that wisdom on to children, or as a preacher passes that wisdom on to his devoted congregation who in social justice need to be woke just like him. In the Cold War era, the far-reaching impacts might be described as a domino theory with a snowball effect. On March 19, 2020, Politico magazine published a cover story in their Friday edition, attempting very early to predict the changes that an invisible enemy and pandemic pathogen would bring to America and perhaps the world, only days after the nation's only physician serving as a state governor closed the public schools in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Associate Professor of Political Science and aspiring author Mark Lawrence Schrad of Villanova University predicted that the pandemic would bring a new kind of patriotism, and he believed that when all is said and done, perhaps we will recognize their sacrifice as true patriotism, saluting our doctors and nurses, genuflecting and saying thank you for your service, as we do now for our military veterans. We will give them guaranteed health benefits and corporate discounts and build statues and have holidays for this new class of people who sacrifice their health and their lives for ours. Perhaps, too, we will finally start to understand patriotism more as cultivating the health and life of your community rather than blowing up someone else's community. Maybe the demilitarization of American patriotism and love of community will be one of the benefits to come out of this whole awful mess. And certainly to those students of history, real students of history or even literature, this conviction that the military or even warfare had its run and that its impending extinction was long overdue was certainly not a novel one arriving with the novel coronavirus. And one need only look back to the year after the war to end all wars, where the most casualties were actually attributed to the Spanish flu and not battlefield injuries in the poem Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owens. In fact, it was after the war that succeeded, the war to end all wars, that a military general said, "Only the dead have seen the end of all wars." Aspiring to a new kind of patriotism, Associate Professor Schrad believed that America has long equated patriotism with the armed forces. He believed that you can't shoot a novel coronavirus. He believed that those on the front lines against coronavirus aren't conscripts, mercenaries, or enlisted men. They are our doctors, nurses, pharmacists, teachers, caregivers, store clerks, utility workers, small business owners, and employees. And he wrote that like Li Wenliang and the doctors of Wuhan, many are suddenly saddled with unfathomable tasks, compounded by an increased risk of contamination and death they never signed up for. But first of all, the facts in terms of fatalities have not borne that out with regard to a novel coronavirus. The fact is that the war to end all wars did not historically end all wars any more than the Spanish flu, attributed to fatalities exceeding 50 million worldwide, did not evolve our culture into a healthier one, did not alter human nature nor change political realities in either the provincial sense nor in the international geopolitics. Change is inevitable and has always been since the beginning of time, just as growth has always been optional, subject to our responsible choices or irresponsible ones. And with science and technology, we are presented opportunities with corresponding potentials for danger and crises in their misapplication and misuse. That is how it always has been and always will be. That is like a science. After the Bronze Age, around the 14th century, it was religion that pushed back against the evil impacts of our choices to advance in science and technology. But since the dawn of the nuclear age, oddly, the loudest cry to apply the brakes has arisen not from the church, but from those who profess science. A cry heard from Hollywood in movies like Failsafe, The China Syndrome, and War Games, albeit under the mask presenting the problems as essentially a military problem. Yet in the beginning of the present century, even the National Academy of Science was issuing the call for a moratorium on discovering new regions even on this planet, on fear that we might find our own annihilation and extinction by discovery of some disease that man cannot control. But at least with regard to viruses, we have known since at least the 1960s the potential for any danger from a virus was very remote, because despite being the most abundant biological particles in the world, their ability to present a danger to mankind had failed to be realized, finding only 219 viruses harmful to man as late as the beginning of this current century. And any rational man should be able to infer from that empirical fact that a present pandemic could not have evolved without human intervention, just as easily as one with a basic understanding of probability and statistics should be able to easily calculate and deduce that the present number of infections and fatalities attributed to a novel coronavirus worldwide or even within the United States, with less than 5% attack rate as validated by the large sample size tracer contact study in China at the beginning of the health crisis, could not have occurred without human assistance, essentially aiding and abetting a foreign power or a military threat. On July 29, 1955, Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson wrote, shortly after the end of the Korean War, or Korean Police Action, the code of conduct we recommend sets a high standard and a reasonable course for members of the armed forces of the future. The conscience and heart of all America are needed in the support of this code, and the best of training that can be provided in our homes, by our schools and churches, and by the armed forces will be required for all who undertake to live by this code. America can no longer afford to think in terms of a limited number of our fighting men becoming prisoners of war and in the hands of an enemy in some distant land. Modern warfare has brought the challenge to the doorstep of every citizen, and so the code we propose may well be a code for all Americans if the problem of survival should ever come to our own main streets. And then, too, the United States must be constantly aware of her position of world leadership, and the code we propose must consider the standard of the Ten Commandments and of our Constitution, as well as our pledge to the United Nations. At the beginning of the Republic, John Adams stated in an address to the militia for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that our Constitution was made for religious and moral people, not suitable for any other. James Madison in Federalist 51 observed that all men are not angels, and even in describing a limited government separated in powers to create checks and balances, it was to be the job of the competing religious sects to shape the consciences of a free people, to provide a counterbalance in what he described as an extra republic. There are no easy answers. We must do the heavy lifting ourselves. There's no magic button to press, nor are there any convenient solutions. And whether that government of the people, by the people, and for the people will longer endure is not up to the people we elect, but up to us as responsible free adults. And that is a responsibility attendant to any right or duty that we may possess, because as Thomas Jefferson wrote, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for governor of Virginia. I ask every Christian, every conservative, every Republican, every Virginian, and every American to, like the motto of the infantry, follow me, and we shall overcome. Honest. And y'all come back now. Yeah. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.